Welcome to the 59th episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit show. I am your host, Mark Hasara, and for over 60 years, my passion has been everything aviation. I'm an airplane nerd. I built plastic model airplanes, hung them from my ceiling as a kid, and that's how I learned about flying. On the Lessons from the Cockpit show, we discuss some of the most extreme and extraordinary military, commercial, and even private flying current events from around the world. Our purpose is to get a better understanding of how does the aviation world work, and to increase critical thinking skills both in the air and on the ground. Many of the stories you're going to hear on the Lessons from the Cockpit show are being told for the very first time. Financial support for the Lessons from the Cockpit show is from Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. These are 4, 6, and 8 foot prints that you can peel off and stick to your walls. They're printed on vinyl, and these are really detailed profile drawings of aircraft from World War II all the way up to 5th gen fighters. When I mean detail, these are exhaustively researched. The stenciling on the missiles you can read on an 8 foot print. So please go by Wall Pilot and look at some of the 128 ready to print graphics we have, or we can do a custom aviation artwork for you of your favorite airplane with your name, tail number, unit, and even weapons load on it. Go by wallpilot.com because that's how we keep this show going. On today's show, I'm going to take a look at some of these documents that have been leaked from the Pentagon and why I'm calling this Pentagon Papers 2.0. There's some really fascinating things that we've learned from these classified documents that have been leaked about what's going on in Ukraine, Russia, with some of our allies, and some really interesting and scary events that have been going on around the world that we didn't know about. An RC-135 that had missiles launched on it, and these Chinese spy balloons. There's been more of them than we were told. So, grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's begin the Lessons from the Cockpit show and take a look at these leaked documents in what I call Pentagon Papers 2.0. Okay, a couple alibis here. I am not going to go into how these documents were posted or how they were leaked. You can go online and read that, and believe it or not, Wikipedia actually has a really good write-up on how this all happened and what's contained in the documents. So if you go to the 2023 documents leak in Wikipedia, there's a really good story that comes up about how these things were leaked, by who, for how long, all the way back to October of 2022, these things have been leaked. So now we're just hearing about it. Second alibi, I'm not going to go into the arrest of this airman from the Massachusetts Air National Guard and his leaking this stuff. I am not going to get political here because I have a very different opinion of what's happening here. Because of listening to some of these intelligence folks on TV and in the news, how did a 21-year-old kid get access to CIA Operations Center reports? He can't do that. There's something going on here that I can't put my finger on for a 21-year-old airman to be able to get a hold of CIA Operations Center reports. That doesn't happen. And some of these things that are supposedly coming out, I don't know how he would have had access to them. I had a TS-SCI clearance, and one of the things I always say, need to know. You can't see this because you don't have a need to know. It's our way of securing all of this stuff. One of the CIA folks that was on TV said he could never have had access to CIA Operations Center reports because those stay in-house. You would have to go to the national intelligence agencies in order to be able to get that kind of stuff, and this kid didn't have access to that. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Several newspaper reporters from New York Times, Washington Post, and one other one, I can't remember, maybe it was Wall Street Journal, actually have good articles on how they were able to track this kid down through his cyber activity. So all of you out there that don't think people are watching, be careful, because I'm telling you they are. I have been in numerous operations centers where we were able to track people very closely through their cyber activity. But here's why this really hurts our national security and our intelligence apparatus, because it shows our methods and discipline. It shows how we do things, who we collect on, how we collect on them. In these reports, it shows the things that we're looking for. So this stuff is really damaging when it's released. And of course, from this, our enemies and our allies know how we're doing something and they change it, which closes that door to us. I'll give you a great example. Early in the war on terrorism, somebody leaked to the New York Post, I think it was, that we were able to track Al-Qaeda and know where they were going to do something next, attack next, or where they were moving to, because we were tracking their financial transfers. We were doing it electronically, and it's a great tool when you have terrorists because it always deals with money, and you can track them through wire transfers. And we were doing that. Well, when that story came out, all of Al-Qaeda's wire transfers stopped and they began doing everything by courier. And what we were hoping to do is from these wire transfers, find where is bin Laden and al-Zawahiri and all these other big name Al-Qaeda folks. And we couldn't do that anymore because these electronic transfers of money dried up. The bank accounts dried up, everything. They started doing everything by courier. Now, later on, that is exactly how we found bin Laden, because the sheikh that we had at Gitmo mentioned something about a name, him being a courier, and they were able to track that down. And as you look at the movies like Zero Dark 30 and all those kinds, it talks about some of this happening. And we were able to find bin Laden through his courier that was taking messages and money and so forth to him in Abbottabad. That's how we were able to find him. But it took a lot longer to be able to do that, because it's easy to tap into these wire transfers and follow them where they're going. And we were able to stop some of their activities in certain places, because when we saw a wire transfer of a lot of money go to a particular country in a particular city, we kind of figured something was going to happen there, and we were able to cut that off. Every classified document that I created during my 24 and a half year career in the military and in the Air Force always had a date on it. That was required by regulations. You had to have a date on it, what classification it was, and who was the authority to declassify it. A lot of these documents were very recent, some of them as recent as the 23rd of March of this year, that had some pretty incredible information in it. One piece of information that's got a lot of people spun up is that we do in fact have Special Forces troops in Ukraine, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Latvia, and there are, according to these documents, about 100 Special Forces soldiers that are in Ukraine from these NATO countries and, of course, the U.S. A lot of people are saying, hey, we didn't sign up for this, and, of course, you have to go to Congress in order to be able to move troops like this. Don't know how this happened, but a document on the 23rd of March of this year says, in fact, there are Special Forces from NATO countries and from the U.S. that are in Ukraine. They're probably providing training and consulting just like the MACSOG guys did in Vietnam. Are they doing direct action? Doubt it, but don't know. I haven't read those documents. If you want to read a really good story about a Special Forces team in the mountains of Afghanistan with a radio and a laser designator, read Gary Bernstein's book called Jawbreaker. That is on my professional reading list, Jawbreaker. And in the book, he has a story about two of his CIA officers that are, I think, in Tora Bora, and they're up in the mountains and they're just raining fire down on Al-Qaeda in the Tora Bora Mountains. They had a great hide site. They had a laser designator, a radio. They're calling in airstrikes with B-52s, fighters, everything, just raining down death and hell on Al-Qaeda fighters in, I think it's the Battle of Tora Bora. Great, great book called Jawbreaker. And the reason I mention this is because that's one of the things that these special forces guys can do too. Not just the CIA, but special forces also. And if we have special forces soldiers there, we have CIA folks that are also running around in Ukraine and Russia doing things also. The documents also contain some stuff on our allies, which is a little concerning to me also. It says that the Russians were going to get rockets and ammunition from the Egyptians. Now, the Egyptians and the Russians have had a relationship for a very, very long time. Since the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, they have been a Russian satellite for a very, very long time. Now, Egypt receives $1.3 billion in military financial aid from the United States. Hopefully, those rockets and ammunition are not from the U.S. that the Egyptians were going to give to the Russians. And of course, the Egyptians have denied that they were going to do any of this. There's a lot of denials that are going on right now based on what we're reading in these documents. That's also something to look at is, hey, our allies are also involved in this. South Korea, they don't want to give some of their artillery shells to the Ukrainians. And there was a document about that also. One of the documents talked about how the U.S. intelligence apparatus has penetrated Russian military forces and the Wagner Group. We have been able to get really good intel on their plans for what they're going to do in Ukraine. And obviously, those plans have probably been given to the folks in Kyiv. Now, I want to tell you a story, and I think I may have talked about this in a previous episode, of the rock stars in Iraq. The CIA started paying off Iraqis inside of Saddam's inner circle and giving them iridium phones, satellite phones, so they could talk to us. This group of people that penetrated Saddam's inner circle and his military were given the nickname the rock stars. It sounds like we've got this rock star thing going on in the Russian military and in portions of their government where we have a pretty good knowledge of the things that they're planning. And of course, that information is probably being given to Ukraine. Now, if Putin finds out about this, which I'm sure he has, then they may go hunting for these people. Not only our people, but the Russian folks that have become this quote unquote rock star group that has been given information on how the Russians are going to prosecute this war and possibly given those plans to Ukraine. Very dangerous situation for our intelligence folks because of being captured as spies. Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been going on for just a little bit over a year. They invaded on the 24th of February in 2022. So they've been going just a couple months over a year now. And there was some estimates of casualties on both sides that were just shocking to me. If the U.S. military had these kinds of casualties and death rate, it would be all over the news, everywhere. They'd be talking about it every day. It mentions that Ukraine casualties are somewhere between 124,500 to possibly 131,000 soldiers wounded or killed. Killed maybe 15 to 17,000. On the Russian side, they've lost what they estimate 35,000 to 43,000 service members. That's incredible, particularly for a war that's only been going on for a year. And I've read several articles where the Russians have lost up to 1,000 tanks. And I don't know how many airplanes or SAM systems they've lost. I know the Ukrainians have lost a lot of their SAM systems because of the Russians' use of these kamikaze Lancet drones that fly around, loiter, find out where some of these really high-valued targets are, like mobile SAM systems, and they just wait for them and come in and blow them up with I think it's a 3 to 5 kilogram warhead, which can cause a lot of damage. There's one S-300 SAM system that got hit by a Lancet drone, and it literally cooked off all 3 missiles in their tube. It was a spectacular explosion. But these losses have happened in 14 months, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. I want to read something to you from an article that's in a New York Magazine Intelligencer. It says Russians' elite special forces have been decimated by the war in Ukraine. The Washington Post reports that classified assessments in the leaked documents indicate that the conflict has gutted Russia's Spetsnaz forces, in large part due to their misuse by Russian commanders. And it may take as long as a decade to build the forces back up again. Now, you got to realize these are really, really highly trained special forces. Think of these guys as Green Berets and SEALs and Delta Force. It takes a long time to train these guys in the skill sets that they're in. It goes on to say, typically Spetsnaz personnel are assigned the sorts of stealthy, high-risk missions, including an apparent order to capture Ukraine's President Zelensky, for which they receive some of the Russian military's most advanced training. But when Moscow launched its full-scale invasion last year, senior commanders, eager to seize momentum and skeptical of their conventional fighters' prowess, deviated from the norm, ordering elite forces into direct combat. This is something they don't do, according to U.S. intelligence findings and independent analysts who have closely followed the Spetsnaz deployment. The rapid depletion of Russian commando units, observers say, shifted the war's dynamic from the outset, severely limiting Moscow's ability to employ clandestine tactics in support of conventional combat operations. U.S. officials believe that the staggering casualties these units have sustained will render them less effective not only in Ukraine, but also in other parts of the world where Russian forces operate, according to the assessment, which ranged from a date of late 2022 to earlier this year. I think I mentioned in a previous episode about our special forces up against this Wagner group and Syrian soldiers trying to overrun an oil refinery near Deir ez-Zor, Syria, in eastern Syria. That battle did not go well for the Wagner group and the Syrian army. The special forces folks inside this refinery called down airstrikes for, I think it was 15 or 16 hours. And a group of 500 Syrian soldiers and Wagner group folks were decimated by these guys. I think, if I remember right, like only 150 out of 500, maybe 200 out of 500 lived through that battle because our special forces, again, radios and laser designators and joint terminal attack controllers as part of their group, or ETACs, calling down fire from above on top of all of these folks. Now, again, these are very, very specific skills that these Spetsnaz and special forces guys have, and it's very hard to reconstitute this group of highly trained special forces soldiers in any military, not just ours, but the Russians particularly. Okay, so now let's get to some of the really good flying stuff that was in these documents. And again, this is from the New York Magazine Intelligencer. More details about the Chinese spy balloons were also leaked in these documents at a top secret level. This article goes on to say that the documents contain top secret information about 4 additional Chinese spy balloons that U.S. intelligence agencies knew about in February after another one of the balloons flew across the continental United States before being shot down. I had a whole episode on that. The documents included annotated images, including one taken of the transcontinental balloon, apparently taken by a U-2 spy plane, pointing out the balloon's similarities and assessing what they appeared to be equipped with. In the Washington Post, they went and talked a little bit more about this because the Washington Post had some of these documents and actually did articles on it. And here's what the Washington Post said about this. The Chinese spy balloon that flew over the United States this year was called Killeen 23 by U.S. intelligence agencies, and it carried a raft of sensors and antennas. The U.S. government still has not identified more than a week or 2 weeks after the shootdown, according to the document. Another balloon flew over a U.S. carrier strike group in a previously unreported incident, and a third crashed into the South China Sea, a second top secret document stated, though it did not provide any specific information of the launch dates. Now, the carrier strike group that it flew over was, I believe, the USS Nimitz down in the South China Sea. So it was collecting on what our carrier strike group was doing. Now, obviously, the strike group commander knew that this thing was flying overhead, but the balloon was following the strike group, which means it is maneuverable. And I talked about this in my spy balloon episode a couple episodes ago. The carrier strike group commander obviously knows this thing's up there. And so he's kind of going calm out or min calm, because every Navy person will tell you the first naval ship that radiates is going to die because you can pinpoint its position. And that's the one thing we spend a lot of time on, is hiding where our carrier strike groups are at, particularly our submarines. That is extremely highly classified because of the nature of what these submarines can do. We have nuclear submarines that are carrying nuclear missiles. We've also got fast attack submarines, which are incredible intelligence tools, and obviously we don't want people collecting on that. But apparently this spy balloon that flew over, and again, I think it's the Nimitz battle group, was probably getting really good full motion video, probably signals intelligence, and was data linking it back to some intelligence center somewhere in China. And of course, their analysts are going through all of the information that they've collected. Now, this Intelligencer article goes on to say, a document produced by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, or NGA, that was dated 15 February, 10 days after the shoot down of the balloon that flew over the United States, contains the most detailed government assessment to date of the Killeen 23 and the two other balloons from the previous years that were labeled Bulger 21 and Accardo 21. Now, here's something really interesting. A U.S. official speaking on conditions of anonymity, imagine that, to discuss sensitive intelligence, said the government naming convention for such balloons is alphabetical from A to Z. It appears that the balloons are named after notorious criminals, including Tony Accardo, James Whitey Bulger, and Donald Killeen. So that's how they named these balloons, after notorious criminals. It's been in all of the news that there was a U-2 spy plane flying around this balloon. And of course, it took incredible pictures of the payload. And in one of the documents that has been released, again, top secret document, it shows what that payload looked like. It says that the solar panels that were attached to the balloon can provide 10,000 watts of power. That's enough power for any type of synthetic aperture radar, full motion video, data link, comm, whatever. That is a lot of power from those solar panels. If you go back and you look at the path of this spy balloon, you'll see that it went over a lot of our very sensitive military bases. If this thing had synthetic aperture radar, which sends microwaves down to the ground, which can penetrate any kind of weather and potentially see through any type of netting and tarps, it will give you a very good image of what's down there and what's underneath it. We used U-2 spy planes with synthetic aperture radar on the nose of the airplane to find targets in Kosovo. And there's one really famous SA-6 site that we found from a U-2 through synthetic aperture radar. It was able to find the control van, the radar, and the transporter erector launcher through some bad weather, and we were able to go and bomb it with what's called an AGM 130 TV-guided 2,000-pound rocket-propelled bomb. The video from that you can find on my TikTok page, by the way, of both the control van being attacked, and as that bomb came down, it flew over the top of the straight flush radar, so that F-15E made a lap, came back around, dropped another AGM 130 and took out the radar. But that was found through synthetic aperture radar, and these pictures from synthetic aperture radar can be very detailed and like target quality kind of pictures. So having this balloon with synthetic aperture capability is kind of scary. But of course, we know when they're radiating from that synthetic aperture radar, obviously, because, some of you have had fuzzbusters in your car. And when a cop's radar gun paints you, it alerts you, it warns you. And of course, we have the same thing for the synthetic aperture radar that's telling us, hey, we're being looked at. The other capability that they think these balloons had was full motion video. And of course, if you've got full motion video, you have the ability to take those photos, make them into stills, and of course, blow them up. Full motion video on our Reaper drones is incredible now. I mean, it is so good that it's in color, it's in the infrared spectrum. You can go white hot, black hot, see anything in color. And again, on my TikTok page, if you go and look at some of the videos there, you'll see some of this incredible full motion video that our Reaper are able to take, and I'm sure the Chinese have the same capabilities of getting these really high resolution, high quality, full motion video of our installations that balloon flew over, or of the carrier battle group that was going through the South China Sea. Videotaping the carrier when it's doing launch and recoveries, videotaping any exercises that we were doing, if we were doing any type of exercises. I doubt the carrier battle group commander was doing anything that would show his hand or her hand. But again, the still pictures that you can get from this and blow up actually gives you a pretty high quality type of photograph of something that you want to take a look at. But the big thing about full motion video is it establishes what we call patterns of life. What is going on the carrier prior to the launch, during the recovery, after the recovery, all of the different things that are going on the aircraft carrier or on the ships that are surrounding it too. Collecting signals and communications and electronic intelligence. And the one thing that this balloon had, it says, I think it was a meter or 1.2 meter dish, which means it was connected to something back in China. That balloon and those balloons that we didn't know about until now were in fact data linking synthetic aperture pictures or full motion video or ELINT, comment, SIGINT back to whatever command and control structure was back in China. Now, this Intelligencer article said something very fascinating about this too, about what was going on in China when these balloons were flying around. And let me read that to you real quick, because this quote is really fascinating. It says, the incursion of the spy balloon into U.S. airspace in late January probably caught elements of China's government by surprise, according to a third document that relies on intercepted communications. Knowledge of the incursion was likely, quote unquote, heavily stovepipe within the Chinese military, which lacks, quote unquote, strong senior oversight of the surveillance balloon program, the document assessed, adding that some in the Chinese government viewed their foreign military's response as poor for allowing this crisis to be sensationalized. So think about this for a moment. Here is this balloon with synthetic aperture radar being able to produce pretty incredible pictures, possibly full motion video, all of that information, signals intelligence, communications intelligence being data linked back to some place in China, and members of the Chinese military and their government don't even know that the balloon's there or that it's doing anything until after it probably shows up in the American news agencies. And of course, then we go and shoot it down after it's been across the entire United States. And there are agencies inside the Chinese government that aren't allowed to have the information. We suffer from the very same thing, though. We have so many intelligence agencies that never talk to each other and play this I have a secret game that really, really hampers our State Department, Department of Defense, Treasury, all these other agencies, because we play I got a secret in some of these agencies and we don't share the information like we should. There are stovepipes in our own government. Oh yeah, shocked face, right? And these stovepipes create problems when it comes time to go after some of our enemies and adversaries. Well, looks like the Chinese had the same problem. Now you have to wonder, what information were these other additional balloons collecting when they were flying in and around the United States or our carrier battle group? And of course, these balloons are showing up in South America, over our allies in the Pacific, particularly around Guam, because Andersen Air Force Base is there, and there's also a Navy base there where submarines and aircraft carriers come into. Guam is a huge military base for American forces. We constantly have a bomber task force there, either B-52s or B-1s and B-2s that can fly missions all throughout the Pacific. And I've flown in and out of Andersen numerous times during my Pacific Tanker Task Force days, and there's just all kinds of stuff going on the island of Guam. There always will be. It's a great place to go for a TDY. A wonderful place to operate out of, because, you go fly a mission in the morning and you're on the beach in the afternoon. But again, the Chinese have been collecting valuable information with these balloons. And I mentioned to you again in a previous episode, the elements of the decision maker's dilemma: risk, time, quality of knowledge, and outcomes. If you have quality knowledge that comes in a timely manner, you can reduce risk because you act with more certainty, with a reduction of second and third order effects, because you are acting with a lot more certainty. And it concerns me that these balloons are flying around and nobody's doing anything about them. And I understand that this thing was flying. It wasn't a threat at first. Went all across the United States, collected on all of our strategic bases, and flew off to the East Coast where we shot it down. But again, that balloon that followed the carrier strike group was maneuvering with the strike group. And I'm sure the strike group commander said, okay, let's come 20 degrees to port. And that balloon followed it, which should be concerning to everyone. The last thing I want to talk about was a potential international incident that is actually pretty scary. But before I talk about what was in the leaked documents, I'm going to give you some personal experiences with this particular airplane that is called the RC-135 Rivet Joint. The RC-135 is a signals, electronics, and communications intelligence collection aircraft. The British fly them and the U.S. flies them. The 55th Reconnaissance Wing out of Offutt Air Force Base. There are several versions of the RC-135, not just the Rivet Joint, but there's also the Cobra Ball, which collects on foreign missile technology, intercontinental ballistic missiles and things like that, and the Combat Scent, which is a really finely tuned measurement airplane that we use to collect on enemy radars so that we can program ECM pods, the electronic countermeasure pods that are on our airplanes, electronic countermeasure systems. And that's the stable of the RC-135. I'm going to specifically talk about the ELINT version, the Rivet Joint. My first real introduction to an RC-135W Rivet Joint began in Okinawa when I was stationed there from 1990 to 1995. The 909th Air Refueling Squadron every week, sometimes twice a week, would have an 09 Echo mission that was supporting Rivet Joint operations in what they call burning wind missions. Now, during the Cold War, the RC-135s were flying intelligence collection missions everywhere. During these missions, it was not uncommon for them to be intercepted flying around the Sea of Okhotsk or around Vladivostok by multiple Russian Air Force airplanes. My aircraft commander, when I was at Pease Air Force Base, had a very good friend of his that was an RC-135 instructor pilot who always took his video camera with him. And on every mission, he would videotape all of these different Russian airplanes that would come up and intercept the RC-135 while it was doing its PARPRO mission. PARPRO meaning reconnaissance out over international waters, collecting on whatever was radiating. He showed me that video, which I think I still have a copy of somewhere, where he's being intercepted by Su-27 flankers. MiG-31 Foxhound pulls up right in front of him, trying to stall one of his engines out, goes into afterburner literally right in front of the RC-135. MiG-23 floggers, Su-15 flagons, MiG-21s, I mean, just all these different airplanes that were coming up and intercepting the RC-135. So this RC-135 pilot, I always say at the beginning of each video, well, we're finally up here waiting for our first visitor. And within 30 minutes, they'd have somebody up on the wing from whatever country they were flying near, but particularly when they were anywhere near Russia. There was always some Russian Air Force fighter that was off their wing watching what they were doing. The RC-135 is also one of the greatest assets on a battlefield. I want to relate the story of one particular crew that was flying a Rivet Joint back in 2016 that received the O'Malley Trophy for being the best reconnaissance crew in the Air Force. And this was the crew of Python 7-1. And it says the crew of Python 7-1 played a key role in the liberation of the northern city of Iraq called Sinjar from Islamic State control by U.S.-backed Kurdish forces. Despite being delayed several hours, and believe me, when we were flying support for the 135s, the Rivet Joint, we would constantly be delayed for, usually it was something in the back of the airplane. Something was broken during the pre-flight that they had to get electronic maintenance out for. And it wasn't uncommon for us at Kadena to be an hour, 2 hours late for takeoff. The crew quickly identified enemy fighting positions, though, once they got on station. Because they collect signals intelligence, communications intelligence, and electronic intelligence, they were able to support 27 different airstrikes by a number of coalition airplanes on the Islamic State fighters. It is reported that they were killed 135 enemy ISIS soldiers during the time period that Python 7-1 was on station. That destruction came because they were able to pinpoint 26 enemy fighting positions and 5 transport vehicles. Remember what I said? The first one that radiate dies, and that means cell phones too. The RC-135 Rivet Joint picks all of this up. Not only do they have people in the back that are linguists that know the language, whether it be Arabic or Russian or Chinese or whatever, they also have the ability to cross-tune and precisely figure out where those fighting positions are within probably a couple hundred meters, I'm saying. And when I saw this, it was an ellipse. You know, they're somewhere in this ellipse on this particular map, but it was pretty tight. It was really tight. So it was pretty dang close. Now, I was running this exercise in Okinawa where the Navy wanted to do data link with the RC-135 and the AWACS. Carrier Air Wing 5 at that time period had what was called ES-3 Vikings, which were the mini version of a Rivet Joint. And of course, their E-2 Hawkeyes wanted to work with our E-3 AWACS, which was part of the 18th Wing, and the RC-135s that on this particular day were participating in the exercise. And I'll never forget this. One of the things that they wanted to do and that they had been having trouble with in the Gulf was being able to establish the links between the Navy and the Air Force aircraft. Our wing didn't know a lot about how the ES-3 Viking worked, but we found out the hard way when Carrier Air Wing 5 was the bad guys. During the time that all of the airplanes were resetting, the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance airplanes of the Navy, the ES-3 and the E-2, and our E-3 AWACS and the Rivet Joint did this data link exercise. And they showed how they were able to move information across the links. And I didn't know this, but the RC-135 in its quote unquote exercise mode can simulate all kinds of different airborne and ground threats. SAM sites, interceptor airplanes, whatever. And they were throwing all of this on the links. And of course, I was in the command post watching this, and it was incredible. During one of the engagements, the ES-3 was flying, and during the debrief, the ES-3 guys in the back end that were electronic countermeasure guys said, yeah, we knew you guys had 4 F-15s up. That's how we were able to figure out, where they were going, what they were doing by their electronic signals. And of course, our F-15 guys are going, whoa, wait a minute. How in the world did you know that we only had 4 airplanes up? We were trying to get 8. And the electronic countermeasure officers in the back said, oh, it was easy. Each one of your F-15s was on a different radar channel, and we picked those up. And we went, whoa, well, isn't that fascinating? Put that away in my brain next time we are playing with the ES-3 Vikings. Well, of course, the Rivet Joint can do the same thing. It intercepts all kinds of electronic communications and signals intelligence. And Python 7.1 was able to go on station and help our coalition forces find these ISIS fighting positions and these trucks because they were radiating and they were sending out signals. As an interesting side note, when the RC-135 was on its way back to Qatar, where it was flying out of Al Udeid, they heard an Iraqi ground force in a battle with Islamic State forces that had them pinned down. They heard the radio signals from the Iraqi troops calling for help. And so they delayed going home and began talking to the Iraqi troops. They were able to pinpoint where they were and pinpoint where the Islamic State forces were. And they stayed in the area long enough to pass critical information to some strike aircraft that came in and destroyed this ISIS forces group that had these Iraqi troops pinned down. This was all in one mission. 27 airstrikes, destroying 26 enemy positions, 5 transport vehicles, and 135 ISIS soldiers dead on one mission, which is why this crew of Python 7.1 was awarded the O'Malley Trophy for being the best reconnaissance crew that year in the United States Air Force. The United Kingdom's Royal Air Force now owns and flies a couple of RC-135 Rivet Joints, pretty much like the ones that the United States Air Force flies. They may have some other capabilities that are specific for NATO and, of course, the defense of the United Kingdom, but generically, they have the same type of signals, electronics, and communications capabilities in the back of the airplane. The RAF Rivet Joints fly the same kinds of missions that the Air Force RC-135s fly on these Burning Wind missions. They'll fly into the Baltic and collect signals and electronic and communications intelligence up there, but they also fly down into the Black Sea, obviously, because there's so much going on between Ukraine and Russia. And their route of flight takes them very close to Crimea. Well, in one of these classified documents, it talks about an engagement between an RC-135 and Russian Su-27 flankers. And as I mentioned before, every time we fly anywhere near Russia in the RC-135 Rivet Joint, whether it's the RAF or USAF, we're going to get intercepted. The RC-135 is going to have visitors, and this particular day was no different. 2 Su-27 flankers take off from Crimea and head out to the RC-135 to intercept it. They are under strict ground control intercept C2, command and control. That is the Russian model. Their Air Force airplanes are commanded and controlled by GCI controllers that are sitting in some command center somewhere watching this radar picture, and they pretty much drive the intercept. Our American fighters work very autonomously. I mean, we still listen to the AWACS and the RJ and so forth, but we don't follow this Russian model of where the GCI controllers are the authority over the airplanes and the intercepts. During this particular intercept, of course, the RC-135 knows that these Su-27s are coming out. They sense their radars. They know that they're communicating back and forth, There's probably a Russian linguist in the back of the airplane, of the Rivet Joint, that's listening to everything going on, interpreting everything going on. And during the intercept, the flankers are still beyond visual range. There is some miscommunication between the GCI controller and one of the flankers. And the flanker pilot misinterprets some command from his GCI controller and says, "Oh, you want me to fire on the Rivet Joint." And he thinks he's got approval to shoot the Rivet Joint down. And of course, this would be a huge international incident with, 25 to 30 people from the Royal Air Force in the back and the crew flying the Rivet Joint. But he locks up the RC-135 and fires a missile at it, trying to shoot it down because he thinks the GCI controller said, "Okay, take it down." Fortunately for the situation, the Alamo missile that he fires malfunctions. Whether it had no rocket motor or misfire or whatever, the missile malfunctions and just goes kerplunk into the Black Sea. Now, of course, the communications between the GCI controller and this flanker pilot, "Okay, I just fired my missile," and the GCI guy is probably going, wait, what? No, that's not what I meant. But it was too late. But the missile misfired, didn't guide, and just went kerplunk into the ocean. The new flankers are carrying Alamo missiles, AA-10 Alamo missiles, and they're C and D models. We call them Chucks and Ducks. I think the Chuck model is the semi-active radar-guided radar homing one, and the D model, the Duck model, is the IR version. And these are long burn motors. They have about 80-mile range. So this Su-27 was somewhere outside of that 80 miles, but still fired at the RC-135 Rivet Joint. The guys in the back of the RC-135 Rivet Joint know all of this is going on because the radar of the flanker goes from like a search mode to a track mode. And when it changes from those two modes and goes to a high repetition frequency, pulse repetition, the guys in the RC-135 know that. And so they're probably screaming over their intercom, "We got locked up! We got locked up! They're firing! They're firing!" Because they probably heard the flanker pilot tell the command back to the GCI, "Okay, master arm on, hammer down, launching a missile," but it misfired. This international incident was avoided, but nobody knew about it until, I guess, this classified report came out. The Minister of Defense, his name is Wallace in the UK, got up in front of Parliament and spilled the beans about what happened during this particular mission. Now, I've had personal experience with this kind of thing. On a previous episode, I mentioned that when Kim Il-sung died and his son took over, his son wanted to bury his dad, the grandfather of the current guy, in Seoul. And of course, they didn't own Seoul. We began flying 12 ships of F-15s in the morning and in the afternoon on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays to keep the North Koreans from coming south, or what we thought they were going to do is come south. As part of that package, of course, we had the AWACS, the E3, which would be on station, and the Rivet Joint on certain days, and the U2 on other days. Well, the first day we did this, I was flying in the tanker, and Weeby Young, a weapons school grad, was leading this 12 ship of F-15s, and they were going to fly 3 lanes, west, center, and east, 3-4 ships of F-15s capping along the DMZ. Now, of course, the F-15s are up close to the DMZ, and there was a couple times where the F-15s got a little frosty because of what was going on across the DMZ with the North Korean fighters. And it seems I remember on one of these missions, some MiG-21s got really close to the border and kind of worried the F-15 guys of what was going to happen. But on this first day when I was flying in the tanker, I'm listening to all this stuff going on, and when the F-15s come off of our tankers, they were tucked under our wings, so it just showed as a 3 ship of tankers, not 12 F-15s flying with us. We were flying in what's called a radar resolution cell. when We Be Young says to the 12 ship, Blones, push Purple One now, they all explode off of the tanker, go up to 32,000 feet, and begin capping with their radars looking into North Korea. This caused almost every SAM site within, I think it was 100 miles of the DMZ on the North Korean side to turn on their radars and come up. And with the SA-5 that's at Tokche-san, the SA-5 has a continuous wave radar, and so it doesn't change modes. And so you kind of got to be careful because it doesn't change modes when it goes from tracking to firing a missile and it following you. And of course, that got everybody's attention. Finally, the North Koreans figured out during this 3-hour vol period in the morning, okay, the Americans are there, they're on the other side, they're not doing anything. And the leader of one of the 4 ships of F-15s got kind of bored and said, okay, well, we're going to the tanker. I'm going to do something just because we're here and got the Rivet Joint here. He turns at the DMZ to the south to come to the tankers and locks up the RC-135 and starts heading toward it. And of course, as soon as he locks up the RC-135, all kinds of bells and whistles are going off in the back. And it takes the crew at the back a little while to calm down because they finally realize, okay, those are F-15 radars, but the hair is up on the back of their necks. And when we get back from this, of course, we have this long debrief over in one of the F-15 squadrons. I can't remember which one. I think it was the Bats, the 44th. Because they had just gotten the new MISSIP airplanes that were AMRAAM capable. During the debrief, the RC-135 mission commander that's in the back, that's running the crew, that's doing the signals, ELINT, SIGINT chores, kind of gets after the F-15 commander of that 4-ship. And he said, who told you to do that? And he goes, well, I thought it would just be cool to do it, and I didn't coordinate with anybody, and I'm sorry, I apologize. The mission crew commander of the back of the RC-135 says, don't ever do that to us again. You guys came off of the DMZ, pointed your radar at us, and locked us up. Do you know what that did to all of us in the back of the airplane? And he goes, I'm sorry. I should have coordinated with you guys. I should have told you guys. And the mission crew commander said something really fascinating. He says, when you locked us up, it looked like Christmas back there. Because all of the bells and whistles and warning lights that they had been locked up and they were going to be engaged had now gone off in the back of the airplane. Now, fast forward to this RAF crew flying near Crimea. The same thing probably happened. It looked like Christmas in the back of that airplane when they got locked up, particularly when they fired the missile because of the mode change in the radar and, of course, the communication back and forth between the GCI controller and the pilot. Missile doesn't launch, missile doesn't go anywhere, but I'm sure that crew got on the ground and said, woo, that was close. And they probably continued their mission through the Black Sea. They're probably on station for a little while longer. But of course, they record all of this too. And then they get back. They probably played all this back going, okay, where did we go wrong here? Okay. And how did they misinterpret what the GCI controller was telling this flanker pilot? Because at the end of every mission, they do a pretty lengthy debrief and of course turn in all of the tapes and the recordings for analysis and everything. But I can only imagine that RAF Rivet Joint crew in their debrief when they got back from this long mission, I'm assuming they were flying out of Akrotiri, Cyprus, because that would be the closest RAF base to the Black Sea. Or maybe they flew out of Suda Bay where our RC-135s operate out of too. I don't know. Akrotiri would be the closest. But imagine being a fly on the wall in that debrief and going, whoa, this was close. And then going back and listening to all of the communications intelligence and looking at all the signals and all of the electronic intelligence they gathered going, wow, that was close. And holy smokes, this was a pretty interesting day in our lives. But this was one of the things that was in these classified documents about this intercept and about them firing a missile at this rivet joint, but the missile malfunctioning and not hitting the airplane. And again, it says that they were out of visual range, but the missile's got 80-mile range. They're the long burn motors, chucks and ducks, like I mentioned. They can still, as long as they're within 80 miles, engage that RC-135. And as you can imagine, the RC-135 is not a maneuverable airplane like a fighter plane. It doesn't have anything on board that can countermeasure these missiles coming at it, and kind of dicey mission for these guys. Over the next couple of weeks, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more information come out from these declassified documents. There may even be more documents. Who knows? A lot of people are saying, he's a traitor. Some people are saying he's a whistleblower. Who knows which way this is going to go? Like I mentioned very early in this podcast, I don't know how this 21-year-old kid got a hold of all of these different documents, particularly CIA Ops Center reports, because those things are not disseminated out amongst the intelligence agencies as this CIA guy talked about. Now, there's a lot of pictures of these documents that are floating around on the web. There's a lot of people that are talking about what's in them. I wanted just to hit some of the important points, some of the things that I thought was important, where the Ukraine war is considered. I mean, all those casualties, 15 to 17,000 dead on one side in 1 year. I mean, that would never pass in our military. It would never get by our politicians. They would never allow that kind of bloodletting on a battlefield. Oh my gosh. Nor 131,000 casualties. But, the Russians suffered 20 million casualties during World War II. They're kind of used to having these kind of high casualty rates, and 1,000 tanks destroyed. Oh my gosh. But folks, I just wanted to talk about this and give you my thoughts and feelings on some of the things that are being reported in these classified documents. I totally condone the release of any type of classified documents like this, because it really does put our national security at risk, because it shows our methods and discipline on how we operate and the things that we talk about. And more importantly, what are our intelligence centers of gravity that we're looking for? What are the most important intelligence things that we want to know about? It even says that we're spying on Zelensky. We're spying on the Mossad and Benjamin Netanyahu for these judicial reforms that he's making. There's all kinds of things in here that kind of pissed off a lot of our allies that are also included in these documents. I hope you've enjoyed me talking about these things. This is kind of a departure from just talking about flying all the time, but I wanted to kind of discuss the leaks of these documents and the things that were in them. This episode 59 of the Lessons from the Cockpit podcast, is financially supported by Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. These are detailed profiles of airplanes printed on vinyl. We do exhaustive research on these things too, and we appreciate those that have sent us pictures to do custom work, because a lot of these custom airplanes really look cool. And like I said, they're extremely detailed. So go by wallpilot.com and pick from the 128 ready to print 4, 6, and 8 foot profiles that you can peel off and stick on your walls. A lot of people just frame them instead of peeling them off too. You can do that. We also do patches and unit emblems if you want to, and custom work. We've had a number of people that said, hey, I flew F-15s. These are the squadrons I was in. This was the time frame. This was my tail number. Put my name on it. Put this weapons load on it. And like I said, we've done exhaustive research of all of these different airplanes, and extremely detailed, really detailed prints. I think that you'll really enjoy. And that's what keeps our show going. So I appreciate all of you tuning in. You can find this episode and previous episodes of the Lessons from the Cockpit show on my website at markhasara.com. You can also pick up my book, Tanker Pilot, Lessons from the Cockpit, from my website. And I do public speaking. If you want to have me come speak to your group, there's a thing that you can fill out. I'll get in touch with you, and I would love to come talk to your group about some of these lessons learned. Thanks again, folks, for tuning in and listening and downloading this episode, and I look forward to talking to you next week on the Lessons from the Cockpit show.